What if the lights go out tomorrow, not because of a storm, not because of a power outage, but because the fuel that keeps the entire modern world running simply stops flowing? What if the pipelines go silent, the tankers stop moving, and the military convoys that guard the world's most volatile energy corridors are no longer enough to hold back the tide of chaos? Right now, at this very moment, intelligence analysts in Washington, London, and Brussels are staring at data that is making them lose sleep. Not the kind of data that makes headlines, the kind that quietly, methodically, and terrifyingly signals that a global catastrophe is 14 days away or possibly less. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on one of the most alarming geopolitical and military crises unfolding right now, a crisis that most mainstream media outlets are barely covering, a crisis that touches every government, every military, every citizen on this planet. We are talking about the global oil supply and the extraordinary, dangerous, and deeply unsettling chain of events that has brought us to the edge of a collapse unlike anything the modern world has ever witnessed. Before we go any further, ask yourself this: when was the last time your government told you the full truth about energy security? When was the last time a military briefing about oil supply routes made the evening news? The answer almost certainly is never. Because what happens in the shadow corridors of energy warfare, the drone strikes on pipelines, the naval blockades in the Strait of Hormuz, the silent cyber attacks on refinery control systems, almost never makes it to your screen in full, unfiltered detail. But today, it does. Let's start with the geography of vulnerability, because this is where it all begins. Roughly 21 million barrels of oil pass through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. That figure represents approximately 20% of all the oil traded globally. Now, consider this. The Strait of Hormuz is only 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. 33 kilometers, a distance you could cycle in under 2 hours. And yet, the disruption of that single corridor through military conflict, naval blockade, or precision missile strikes would trigger an immediate and catastrophic energy shock across Europe, Asia, and North America simultaneously. Military planners have known this for decades. What they are now confronting, however, is something they did not fully model: the simultaneous convergence of multiple threat vectors attacking the global oil supply at the same time from multiple directions. In the past 72 hours alone, and we want you to think carefully about that time frame, there have been confirmed reports of escalating naval activity in the Persian Gulf. Iranian fast attack boats have been shadowing commercial tankers at distances that naval analysts describe as intentionally provocative. The USS Dwight D. Eisenhower carrier strike group, which had been repositioned to the Red Sea following the escalation of Houthi attacks on commercial shipping, has now altered its operational posture. What does that mean in plain language? It means that the United States Navy is preparing for the possibility of direct military engagement in waters that carry nearly a quarter of the world's daily oil supply. And here is where the first alarm bell sounds loudly, because if you study the military doctrine of modern naval warfare, you understand that the transition from operational posture adjustment to kinetic engagement can happen in under 6 minutes. A single anti-ship missile, a single naval mine, a single incident in those narrow waters, and the price of oil does not just spike, it detonates. And when oil detonates in price, the entire scaffolding of the modern global economy begins to shake. But the Persian Gulf is only one front. Let us take you somewhere else, somewhere that rarely appears on American or British news networks, but which military analysts are watching with equal intensity. The Druzhba Pipeline, the longest oil pipeline in the world, stretches 500 kilometers from Russia through Ukraine, Slovakia, Hungary, and into the heart of Central Europe. Since the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war, that pipeline has become the single most contested piece of energy infrastructure on the planet. And just days ago, a series of explosions, the cause of which has not been officially attributed, damaged a critical pumping station along the Polish stretch of the pipeline. Energy monitors confirmed a reduction in flow. The ripple effects were immediate. Spot prices at European oil exchanges jumped. Emergency reserve protocols were quietly activated in 3 NATO member states. Here is what we need you to understand, and this is critical. These are not isolated incidents. They are not coincidences. When you overlay the naval escalation in the Strait of Hormuz, the infrastructure attacks along the Druzhba corridor, the ongoing Houthi disruption of Red Sea shipping lanes, and now, and this is the detail that analysts are calling a potential game changer, the reported cyber intrusion into the operational technology networks of 2 major Gulf state refineries. You are not looking at a series of unrelated events. You are looking at a coordinated, multi-vector assault on the architecture of the global oil supply. And the 14-day window we mentioned at the beginning of this report is not an arbitrary figure. It comes directly from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve drawdown models published by the International Energy Agency, combined with current consumption rates and confirmed supply disruption data. In 14 days, based on current disruption trajectories and absent any dramatic diplomatic or military intervention, the buffer that keeps global oil markets from entering freefall will be effectively exhausted. 14 days. And the world's militaries are moving quietly, urgently, and with a speed that should tell you everything you need to know about how seriously they are taking this threat. Let us talk about what military mobilization looks like in an energy crisis, because it is not what most people imagine. It is not tanks rolling through cities. It is not fighter jets screaming across open skies. The first and most critical military response to an energy crisis is the deployment of special operations forces to protect critical infrastructure, pipelines, refineries, offshore platforms, and the choke points through which oil must flow. Right now, U.S. Special Operations Command has elements deployed in multiple Gulf states in a posture that NATO officials are describing only as enhanced advisory presence. That language, to anyone familiar with how military operations are communicated publicly, is a significant understatement. British SSS units have been conducting what the Ministry of Defense calls routine training exercises in Oman, exercises that happen to be taking place directly adjacent to the Mazandaran Peninsula, which is the Omani territory that overlooks the Strait of Hormuz. French naval assets have repositioned from their base in Djibouti. Israel's Dolphin-class submarines, diesel-electric vessels capable of operating undetected for weeks, have not been publicly accounted for in their usual patrol areas. These are not coincidences. These are the early, quiet movements of a military machine preparing for a scenario that no government wants to announce publicly, because the moment it is announced, the panic it triggers could cause the very collapse they are trying to prevent. Now, let us bring you into the world of military technology, because the weapons and systems that will determine the outcome of this crisis are unlike anything the public has been shown. The Houthi campaign in the Red Sea, which has disrupted over 400 commercial vessel transits since January, has been primarily executed using Iranian-designed Shade 136 kamikaze drones, wore 20,000 weapons that are being used to attack vessels worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The economic asymmetry of that exchange should terrify every defense planner in the world. A single Houthi drone swarm, coordinated with a maritime mine deployment in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, could shut down Red Sea oil shipping for weeks. The U.S. Navy's response, deploying billion-dollar guided missile destroyers to shoot down 20,000 drones using 2 million missiles, is, by any military accounting, a losing proposition in the medium term. But the technological dimension goes deeper still. Intelligence sources are reporting that the cyber intrusions into Gulf state refinery systems, the ones we mentioned earlier, bear the hallmarks of tools previously associated with the Sandworm group, a threat actor widely attributed to Russian military intelligence. If confirmed, this would represent a direct, covert Russian operation against Gulf energy infrastructure, an extraordinary escalation that would force a fundamental recalculation of how NATO and its partners respond. Because the moment a cyber attack on oil infrastructure is traced to a nation-state actor, it triggers Article 5 considerations under NATO's collective defense framework. And Article 5, as history has demonstrated, changes everything. Meanwhile, China, and this is the dimension of the crisis that Western analysts are perhaps most concerned about, is watching all of this with extraordinary attention. China imports approximately 10 million barrels of oil per day, the majority of which transits through the very sea lanes now under threat. The People's Liberation Army Navy has been expanding its presence in the Indian Ocean at a pace that has alarmed defense planners in New Delhi, Washington, and Canberra. Chinese Type Zu-155 destroyers, among the most capable surface combatants in the world, have been operating in waters that intersect directly with the oil corridors now at risk. Is China preparing to act as a protector of those corridors, or is it positioning itself to exploit the crisis in ways that serve its own strategic interests? The answer to that question may determine whether this 14-day window leads to a managed emergency or a full-scale catastrophe. Let us pause here and give you something concrete to hold on to, because we know that when you are confronted with information of this scale and gravity, it can feel overwhelming. Here is what the data tells us about what comes next if this crisis is not contained. An immediate 40 to 60% spike in crude oil prices based on historical models from the 1973 Arab oil embargo and the 1990 Gulf War disruption would trigger automatic recession mechanisms in the United States, United Kingdom, Germany, Japan, and South Korea within 90 days. Inflation, which central banks have spent years attempting to tame, would reignite at levels not seen since the 1970s. The military implications are equally severe. Every modern military, from the US Army to the British Royal Navy to the German Bundeswehr, runs on petroleum, and oil supply collapse does not just hurt consumers at the pump. It degrades military readiness at the precise moment when military readiness is most needed. And here is something that almost no one is talking about publicly, but which military strategists are acutely aware of: the adversaries who are most actively threatening the global oil supply: Iran, Russia's proxy networks, and the non-state actors they supply have built their entire strategic doctrine around the assumption that the West's dependence on oil is its greatest vulnerability. They are not wrong. The global oil crisis is not a side effect of the current geopolitical confrontation. It is the objective. It is the target. It is the weapon. This is why the next 72 hours are so critical, because right now, behind closed doors, emergency diplomatic back channels are open between Washington and Riyadh. The Saudis, who have the largest spare production capacity of any oil-producing nation, are being asked to increase output immediately. But Saudi Arabia is also navigating its own complex geopolitical calculus. It has been deepening its ties with China through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It has its own concerns about Iranian escalation in the Gulf. And it is watching how the United States responds to the current crisis as a signal of American credibility and commitment. The outcome of those conversations, which will likely be resolved or collapse within the next few days, will determine whether the 14-day countdown can be stopped. What happens if it cannot? What happens if the diplomatic channels fail, the military escalation continues, and the global oil supply enters genuine crisis? The scenarios range from severe to catastrophic. In the moderate scenario, we see emergency rationing protocols implemented in European nations, emergency SPR releases by the United States, and a rapid global recession. In the severe scenario, we see military conflict in the Strait of Hormuz, direct confrontation between US and Iranian naval forces, and a disruption to oil flows severe enough to trigger political instability in multiple oil-dependent nations simultaneously. In the catastrophic scenario, which no analyst wants to model, but which responsible defense planning must account for, we see a broader regional war drawing in multiple great powers, with energy infrastructure as both the prize and the battlefield. None of these outcomes are inevitable. History has shown us repeatedly that crises of this magnitude can be navigated, de-escalated, and resolved through a combination of military deterrence, diplomatic skill, and technological adaptation. The transition to renewable energy, accelerated by exactly the kind of crisis now unfolding, may ultimately prove to be the most consequential long-term response. But that transition takes years, sometimes decades, and right now the world does not have years. It may not have weeks. What it has is 14 days. 14 days to prove that the systems of diplomacy, military deterrence, and international cooperation that have prevented global catastrophe for the past 80 years can still function under conditions of maximum pressure. 14 days to demonstrate that the lessons of 1973, of 1990, of 2003 have been learned and internalized by the leaders and commanders now sitting at the center of this crisis. 14 days to show that the world's most advanced military machines, with all their precision weapons, satellite surveillance, cyber capabilities, and strategic depth, can be deployed not to wage war, but to prevent it. We will be watching every development, every naval movement, every pipeline report, every diplomatic communique, every intelligence signal that crosses the desks of the analysts and commanders now carrying the weight of this moment. And we will bring it to you unfiltered, deeply researched, and with the seriousness that a crisis of this magnitude demands. Because this is not just a story about oil. It is a story about the architecture of the modern world and whether that architecture can hold under the most intense pressure it has ever faced. The clock is ticking. The 14 days have begun. Stay alert, stay informed, and do not look away, because what happens next will define the course of the next decade and possibly much longer than that. If this kind of deep dive military and geopolitical analysis is what you come here for, make sure you are subscribed, make sure your notifications are on, and share this with everyone you know who needs to understand what is truly at stake, because the next update may come sooner than any of us would like.